My name is Ida Vickers. I am 79 years old, and I have been a licensed practical nurse in the province of British Columbia for 41 years until my retirement in the spring of 1998. I am recording this in my kitchen in Smithers on the 14th of March 2011 because my son Callum telephoned me last Sunday and told me that his own daughter, my granddaughter Petra, who is 11 years old and clever in the way that frightens you a little, has begun asking questions that I do not know how to answer from a distance, and I have decided that I will answer them here, once, in full, and leave this recording where she can find it when she is old enough to need it, more than she needs protecting. There is a small device on the table in front of me that my son's wife showed me how to use. I am told it will record for as long as I speak. I intend to speak for a while. I have kept this secret for 52 years. The people who kept it with me are, most of them, gone. Walter Fisker died in November of 2008, and he was the last of the ones who were there at the beginning. Before Walter there was Henny Sproul, and before Henny there was my own husband, Bernard, who died in 1994, and who carried this as quietly as he carried everything, which is to say, without complaint, and without ever once suggesting that it had cost him anything, though I know it cost him something. They are all gone now, and I am 79. And my left hand has been unreliable for 2 years, and I am not foolish enough to believe I have indefinite time. So, this is what I told the recorder on an ordinary Tuesday in March, with snow on the Bulkley Range, and a pot of tea going cold at my elbow. I was 27 years old in the summer of 1959, and I had been working at the Dease Lake nursing station for 14 months. I had come up from Prince George the previous spring with a certificate, a duffel bag, and an almost complete ignorance of what the North actually meant. I understood cold in the abstract. I understood distances the way you understand them from a map, which is to say not at all. Dease Lake is in the northwestern corner of British Columbia, not far from the Yukon border, in country that makes the geography you knew before feel timid by comparison. The lake itself sits at roughly 3,000 feet above sea level, and the Cassiar Mountains are all around it. And in those years, the road in and out was not what I would call a road by any standard I had previously applied to the word. There were perhaps 200 people in the settlement when I arrived, and they were a mix of Tahltan families who had been there since long before the settlement had a name anyone had bothered to write down, and white trappers and prospectors and their families who had come in through the 30s and 40s, chasing whatever the land were rumoured to hold. The nursing station was a single building with 4 beds, a small surgery, and a supply room that was never quite adequately stocked. I was the only nurse assigned there. There was a doctor who came from Telegraph Creek 3 or 4 times a year when the weather permitted. The rest of the time, I was what there was. I say all of this because I want you to understand the kind of person I was before the summer of 1959 and the kind of place I was in. I was precise. I was trained. I believed, with the confidence of a young woman who has passed her examinations and been told she is competent, that what could not be measured could not be trusted. I did not hold any particular religious conviction. I did not believe in things that did not have a name in a textbook. I want you to understand that the woman who walked into the bush on the morning of the 22nd of June, 1959, was not a credulous woman. She was not a woman who was looking for anything that could not be found in a supply catalogue. Nora Hennessy came to the nursing station on the morning of the 19th of June. She was 24 years old, and she had been married to a prospector named Glenn Hennessy for 3 years, and she was 7 months pregnant. She was tall, very thin, except for the pregnancy, with dark red hair that she wore in a single braid, and eyes the color of the lake in overcast weather. She came in because she had been having trouble sleeping, and her ankles were swollen, and she wanted to know if that was something to worry about. It was not. We talked for an hour. She was calm and specific in the way that people who live far from help learn to be, because panic is a luxury and specificity is a tool. She told me that she and Glenn were living at their claim site, which was 22 miles northeast of the settlement, on a creek that ran out of a ridge nobody had gotten around to naming yet. She told me the baby was due in September, and she intended to come into town in August and stay through the birth. I told her that was sensible. I gave her some iron tablets, and she left. Glenn Hennessy came to the nursing station alone on the morning of the 22nd, 3 days later. He was a man of perhaps 30, heavy-set, with a dark beard and a way of standing in a doorway as if he were trying to decide whether to enter. He told me that Nora had not come back to the claim site the previous evening. He had looked along the creek and around the perimeter of their camp for several hours and found nothing. He had come into town in the night to get help, and he had spoken to Walter Fisk, who was the closest thing Dease Lake had to an administrator in those years. And Walter had organized 4 men to go out and look. He came to tell me in case she was hurt and needed medical attention when they found her. I went with them. I will not detail the search itself at length, because it lasted 2 days, and it was, for most of those 2 days, exactly what you would expect a search in that country to be. Difficult and cold and without result, the kind of searching that teaches you very quickly what the bush thinks of your intentions. I will say that on the evening of the 2nd day, when the men were ready to turn back, and Glenn Hennessy had a look on his face that I could not bear to name, I found the place where she had fallen. It was on a slope above the creek, perhaps 1.5 miles from the claim site, where the ground had given way under her, and she had slid 30 feet into a small ravine. She was not there when I found it, but she had been there. There was blood on the rock, dried brown, a quantity consistent with a hard fall rather than a catastrophic injury, and there were marks in the soft ground where something very large had been standing above the ravine, and where Nora's shape in the moss showed she had been lifted from where she landed. The marks above were not boot prints. They were not the prints of any animal I knew how to name. I stood looking at them for a long time. Then I called to the men. Walter Fisk crouched over those prints for a long time without speaking. Glenn Hennessy looked at them and then looked at the tree line and did not speak at all. The other men, whose names were Pete Darvish and Horace Collard, and a young Talton man named Felix Kwok, who had come with us because he knew that country better than any of the white men, looked at the prints and then looked at Felix. And Felix looked at the prints for a moment and then said, in a voice that was very quiet and carried no particular emotion, that whoever had picked the woman up had gone north and that we should go back to the settlement and wait. He said this as if he were giving directions to a place everyone already knew. I want to say something about Felix Kwok here, because he matters to everything that came after, and because he is dead now, having lived to be 91 years old, and having died in his sleep in the house where he was born, which is the kind of death a person earns rather than merely receives. He was 22 in that summer, slight and very quiet, with a particular way of going still, when he was thinking, that I came to recognize over the years as the most reliable signal that what came next would be worth hearing. He spoke English and Taltan and some French, and he had a precision with language in all three that put me to shame. He did not explain what he knew about those prints. Not then, and not for several years afterward. He said only what he said: go back and wait. And because there was nothing else to do, and because something in his voice carried the weight of someone who has been told something true by people he trusted, we went back and we waited. Nora Hennessy came back to the settlement on the morning of July the 5th, which was 13 days after she disappeared. She walked in from the North Road in the early morning, before most of the settlement was awake, and it was Henny Sproul who saw her first, because Henny ran the small general store and was always up before anyone else. Henny Sproul was at that time 58 years old, a widow of 8 years, compact and plain-spoken, and possessing a quality that I can only describe as unshockable, which is different from being unsurprised. She was not unsurprised by the things life brought her. She simply declined to be broken by them. She saw Nora come up the road, and she went out to meet her, and she brought her to the nursing station without waking anyone else, and she sat in the corner of the room while I examined Nora, and she did not ask a single question until Nora was ready to answer one. Nora was not injured beyond the original fall, which had given her a deep bruise along her left side and a cut on her forehead that had been cleaned and closed with a care that I could not account for when I examined it. Someone had cleaned the wound with something. The edges were neat. The bruising was already yellowing toward resolution. She was thin and very tired, and she had been eating, because she was not depleted in the way you become when you have gone without food for 2 weeks. She sat in the bed and let me examine her, and she was cooperative and specific, the way I remembered from our first meeting, and when I had finished, she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the window for a moment, and then said that the baby was fine and that she needed to speak to her husband. Glenn Hennessy came to the nursing station within the hour. I left them alone. What passed between them in that room I know only in outline, because Nora told me pieces of it over the years that followed, and never all at once, and never in a single sitting, and I do not know even now that I have the full shape of it. What I know is that Glenn came out of that room after 2 hours with a face from which every ordinary expression had been cleared away, the way a table is cleared after a meal, and that he went directly to Walter Fisker's office and spoke to him privately for a long time, and that when he came out of that office he was quieter than he had been going in, which, for a man who was already very quiet, was a considerable distance to travel. Nora stayed at the nursing station for 3 days, and on the second of those days she told me what she could bring herself to tell me. She had fallen, she said, and she had lain in that ravine for what she believed was most of a day. She was not unconscious, but she was badly stunned, and she could not climb out. Toward evening something came. She said she heard it, moving through the timber above the ravine before she could see it, and that she had been afraid, and that the fear was of a particular kind that I think anyone who has been alone and helpless in a wilderness night will recognize, not the shock of sudden danger, but the slow, cold certainty that you are very small and the world is very large, and there is a wide distance between those two facts. Then it came to the edge of the ravine, and looked down at her, and the fear went somewhere else. She did not know how to describe what she saw. She tried in those days at the nursing station and in the years that followed, and she got a little closer each time, and the closest she ever came was this. It was enormous, she said, and dark, and it moved with a deliberateness that nothing that size should be capable of. And its face was not the face of an animal. She was emphatic about this. She was a woman who had spent 3 years in the bush, and she knew what animal faces looked like in low light, and this was not that. It looked at her, she said, in the way that implies intention, and she understood in some way she could not translate into medical terminology that it had come specifically because of her, not because it had stumbled on her the way an animal stumbles on a thing. It descended the ravine, and it lifted her without any particular difficulty, and it carried her north. She did not say how far it carried her, or precisely where it took her. She said she was somewhere in a fold of the hills above the creek, in a place that was sheltered, and that she was not cold, and that she was not left alone. She was there for 13 days. The baby was born in September, as planned. Not at the nursing station. Nora had come into town in August, as she said she would, and I attended the birth in the small house she and Glenn had taken for the season. The labour was uncomplicated, and the birth was quick for a first child. And the boy arrived at 4:40 in the morning on the 8th of September, 1959, weighing 9 pounds and 6 ounces. Glenn was present. He held the boy for a long time before he said anything, and what he said when he finally spoke was Callum, which had been his own father's name. I remember the particular silence in that room after he said it. Not the silence of difficulty, but the silence of something settled. Callum Hennessy was, from the beginning, a child who required attention. Not because he was difficult. He was not difficult. He was remarkably even-tempered, and he slept well, and he fed without trouble. And he reached every developmental marker on time or ahead of it, and there was nothing wrong with him by any measure I knew how to apply. But he was large. Not in a way that alarmed me at first, because some children are large, and Glenn was a big man, and Nora was tall, and there is nothing remarkable in a child who inherits his parents' size. But by 8 months, Callum was the size of an 18-month-old. And by a year he was the size of a child of 2.5, and I began to note this in the record I kept, which was the most private record I have ever maintained, and which I have never shown to anyone. By the time he was 4 years old, Callum Hennessy stood as tall as a child of 7 or 8, and his hands were proportioned in a way that you noticed without quite being able to say why. And his eyes were dark and attentive in a manner that reminded me, every time I looked at him, of what Nora had told me about the face in the ravine. I say I have never shown that record to anyone. That is not entirely true. I showed it to Felix Kwok in the spring of 1963, when Callum was 3.5, and it was already clear that the growth was not a normal variation, but something else. Something consistent and purposeful in its own logic. And Felix looked at the numbers and dates and the measurements. And he nodded slowly and said that this was not the first time. He did not elaborate on that for another 2 years. I have thought about those words for 48 years. This was not the first time. He said them without surprise and without alarm, in the same voice he had used to say, "Go back and wait," and I understood that he was not being mysterious out of preference, but out of precision. He would tell me what he knew when he could tell it accurately, and not before. Glenn Hennessy was, in those years, doing something that I do not know how to name fairly. He was raising a child he had not fathered, and doing so without visible difficulty and without, ever once, in all the years I knew him, behaving toward Callum in any way that suggested the distinction mattered to him. The love was not performed. It was not the love of a man doing what was required of him. It was the love of a man who had looked at a child and recognized something worth loving, and had let the rest of it stand where it stood. I did not ask him about this for many years. When I finally did ask him, once, obliquely, whether he found it hard, he looked at me with a mild surprise and said that Callum was his son. He said it, the way you say something that is simply true, the way you say the lake is cold or the road is long. That was the first lie. There would be many more, told to registrars and to doctors in the South, and to a school principal in Smithers, who wanted an explanation for why a 9-year-old was the size of a 13-year-old, and had a stillness about him that unnerved the other children. Glenn told those lies without distress. He was protecting his son. That was the only calculation he made. I need to tell you about the night of October the 3rd, 1962. Because it was the night I saw the father for the first, and, as it turned out, the only time with my own eyes. And because it changed the quality of my understanding in a way that none of Nora's testimony, precise and reliable as it was, had quite managed to do. Callum was 3 years old. I was at the Hennessy house in the evening because the boy had had a fever the previous day, a mild one, nothing that required anything beyond fluids and attention, but I had wanted to check on him. Glenn was away at the claim site for the week. Nora and I sat in the kitchen after Callum went to sleep, and we were talking about something ordinary, something domestic, a matter of no importance, and then Nora stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence and looked at the window. I looked at the window. There was nothing there. There was the dark beyond the glass and the reflection of the kitchen lamp. And I could see the edge of the yard and the tree line beyond it, which was perhaps 60 feet from the house. And then something at the tree line moved in a way that did not resolve into any familiar shape, and I understood that what I was looking at was not the tree line, but something standing at the tree line, and I understood its scale by the way it related to the spruce behind it. The spruce that I knew to be perhaps 50 feet high, and the thing at the edge of the trees was more than half as tall as those trees. And it was standing still in a way that was not the stillness of concealment, but the stillness of attention. Nora did not get up. She turned in her chair so that she was facing the window directly, and she did not speak. And her face in the lamplight had an expression I have been trying to find the right word for ever since. It was not fear, and it was not happiness in any ordinary sense, and it was not grief, and it was not the soft, warm expression of a woman looking at something she loves without complication. It was something older than any of those things, and more deliberate, the face of someone standing in the truth of their own life, without flinching and without pretending that the truth is something other than what it is. She looked at the tree line for perhaps 3 minutes. Then the shape at the edge of the trees was no longer there, and Nora turned back to the kitchen and picked up her tea and finished what she had been saying. I did not sleep that night. I drove home in the dark, and I sat in my own kitchen, and I did not sleep. And somewhere around 4 in the morning, I realized that what I had been sitting with for those hours was not fear and not disbelief, and not the particular intellectual vertigo of someone whose understanding of the world has been cracked open. What I had been sitting with was something much simpler, which was the recognition that Nora had been telling me the truth, every detail of it, for 3 years, and that I had believed her in the way you believe someone about whom you have no doubts, but that now I knew, in the part of me that is located below the intellect, and is not impressed by examinations or certificates, that the world was more full than I had been assuming. I do not know what I would have done with that knowledge if I had been 27 and alone in it. But I was 30 years old, and I had Nora and Glenn and Henny Sproul and Felix Kwok and my husband Bernard, who had known from the first year and had received the information with the same equanimity he brought to everything, and who had said, when I told him, that he supposed the North had its own customs, and that we should not be so quick to tell anyone who wasn't already involved. Bernard. I am going to take a moment with Bernard because he deserves more than a passing reference, and because I have not spoken about him in a long time to anyone who didn't already know him and didn't already love him. Bernard Vickers was a mining surveyor from Terrace who had come to Dease Lake in 1958 for a summer contract and had not left because he found the country beautiful and the people worth staying for, and he was 41 when I arrived and 42 when we married, and he was the most consistently decent man I have ever known, decent in the specific sense. He knew what was decent and he did it, without announcement, without requiring recognition. He was not tall. He had a beard that was already going grey when I met him, and grey eyes that missed nothing, and a habit of going quiet when the conversation turned to something important, which was how you knew he was paying complete attention. He never met Callum's father. He never tried to. He understood. I think that some things require a particular kind of respect that looks, from the outside, like disinterest, and that the respect in this case meant staying on his side of the tree line and letting the thing be what it was. Callum grew. By the time he started school in Smithers, where we had moved in 1965 after the Dease Lake nursing station was consolidated into a larger regional facility, he was, at 6 years old, the physical size of a 10-year-old, and he had a quality of deliberateness that the teachers found difficult to categorize. He was not slow, and he was not inattentive. He was, if anything, too attentive. He had a way of hearing things that were said across a room and registering them with a precision that made adults uncomfortable in the way that very accurate witnesses make people uncomfortable. He was not unhappy in school. He made friends with the steadiness of a child who is interesting without performing interest. And the friends he made, he kept, which I came to understand as a quality he shared with his father, in a way that I could not entirely explain, because it was not merely a social gift, but something more like a constitutional commitment. He did not leave people. Nora came to Smithers in 1966. Glenn had followed the survey work south, as surveyors did in those years, and they had taken a house 20 minutes outside of town, on a property with timber at the back and a creek in the yard, and I visited them every second Sunday throughout Callum's childhood and into his adolescence, and I watched him become himself in the way that children do, which is to say with a thoroughness that is sometimes frightening and always, eventually, right. He did not question what he was. I mean by this that the question of his father, which I had expected to become a crisis at some point in his early adolescence, the way such questions become crises, did not become a crisis. It became, instead, a piece of information that Nora gave him gradually and carefully over several years, beginning when he was 8 and finishing, in the sense that she gave him all she had to give, when he was about 14, and he received it in increments, and sat with each increment and added it to what he already knew about himself, which was already considerable. He was a child who knew himself. I do not know how to account for that, except to say that some children are born with a certain density of self that the ordinary confusions of childhood cannot dissolve. He asked me about it only once directly. He was 11 years old, and he had been at our house for the afternoon, and Bernard was in the workshop out back, and Callum and I were sitting in the kitchen, and he said, without any particular preamble, that he understood his father lived in the hills north of Dease Lake, and that he wondered if I had ever seen him. I told him about the night of October the 3rd, 1962. I told him about the tree line and the shape at the edge of the spruce and his mother's face in the kitchen window. I did not dress it up, and I did not minimize it, and I told him exactly what I had seen and what I had understood from it, and he listened in the complete way that was characteristic of him. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that his mother said the same, that the face was not the face of an animal. He said this with a kind of satisfaction, as though a thing he had already decided was being confirmed rather than revealed. Then he asked if he could have another piece of the bread I had baked that morning, and I gave it to him, and we talked about something else. Felix Kwok told me, in the winter of 1965, what he had meant when he said that this was not the first time. We were sitting in the truck outside the store in Smithers, which is where Felix and I talked when we wanted to talk without being overheard, a habit we had developed over the years, and which now I find both necessary and a little comic. He told me that his own grandmother, on his mother's side, a Taltan woman named Setsun, who had died in 1941 at a very great age, had told him a story when he was a boy about a woman from her grandmother's generation, who had spent a winter in the hills above the Stikine and had come back in the spring with a child who grew the way Callum was growing, and that this was not a story in the way that most stories are stories, a thing shaped for teaching or for pleasure, but a record, the kind of record that people keep when they need to remember a truth that official accounts will not hold. He said there had been others, in different generations and different places, and that the Taltan and the Tlingit and the Kaska all had their own names for the ones who lived in the deep timber, and that the names varied but the quality described was consistent, large, careful, gentle in the specific way of something that knows its own strength, present in the country since long before any system of naming had arrived to categorize it. He said that his grandmother had called them the quiet ones, which is not a precise translation, but is the nearest he could get in English, and that the quiet ones did not come close to the settlements unless something drew them, and that what drew them was grief, or need, or a kind of recognition that he could not explain precisely, only indicate. I have thought about that word, recognition, for the better part of 50 years. I do not know what was recognized when the creature found Nora in that ravine in the summer of 1959. I do not know what drew it or what it saw in her, or by what faculty it understood that she was hurt and that she mattered. I know only what Nora told me, which is that she was not afraid, and that she was not cold, and that she was not alone for those 13 days, and that when she came back, she was already decided about something, that she never fully put into words, but that organized the rest of her life as surely as a spine organizes a body. She had made a decision in those 13 days, and it was the kind of decision that is made not by reasoning through alternatives, but by recognizing once and clearly what is true. Glenn Hennessy died in 1978 of a cardiac event at the age of 49. He died at the claim site, which he had never entirely abandoned, and it was 2 days before anyone found him, which is the kind of death that happens in that country, and that the country does not apologize for. Callum was 18 years old. He drove up to Dease Lake with 2 of his friends, and he brought his father home, and he organized the burial, and he bore himself throughout with a gravity that I thought then, and think now was not grief suppressed, but grief fully present, which is a different thing entirely. He did not fall apart, and he did not pretend. He was sad in the way that a man is sad when he has lost something true, and he let that sadness be visible to the people who had earned the right to see it, and he kept it private from everyone else. After Glenn's death, Nora sold the house outside Smithers and moved back to the Dease Lake area. She was 43 years old, and she did not explain this decision to anyone except me, and what she told me was simply that she was done being at a remove from the place that had been central to her life for 20 years. She took a small house near the lake, and she worked at the general store, which had changed hands twice since Henry Sproul's time, but was still recognizably the same store in its essential purposes, and she lived there quietly and well for another 20 years. I visited her every summer. Bernard and I would drive up, because Bernard had never entirely stopped loving that country himself, and we would spend a week, and we would walk the lake road in the evenings, and Nora would make food, and we would talk for long hours. And occasionally, on the last night of our visit, Nora would say that she had been hearing the sound in the hills again, which was what she called it. The sound, by which she meant a particular low, tonal pattern that she had first heard in the summer of 1959, and that she recognized in the way you recognize a voice. You have not heard in years, but have not forgotten. She said it without sentiment and without drama. She said it the way you report a weather observation. I do not know what she heard. I was never there when she heard it. I have no way to verify it against any standard I was trained to apply. I am recording this not to assert that I know what the sound was, but to record that she heard it, and that she heard it consistently, and that she was not a woman who invented things, and that the inventory of what she told me over 20 years of those summer visits held together with the kind of internal consistency that honest testimony has and fabricated testimony does not. Nora died in the spring of 1999 of pancreatic cancer, quickly and without much ceremony, which was consistent with how she had lived. She was 64 years old. She died at her house near the lake, with Callum present, and with me present, and with Felix Kwok present, who had come down from where he lived north of the settlement, and who sat in the corner of the room in the specific way he had of being both present and unobtrusive, and who held her hand for the last 2 hours. She was not afraid, and she was not in great pain, and she was not in the end sad. She was something past sad, in the territory that lies on the other side of it, where the losses have been counted and accepted, and what remains is the simple fact of a life that was genuinely and fully lived. I held her other hand. I did not say anything useful. I did not think there was anything useful to say. Some moments are not for words, and a nurse who has been in the room for enough of them knows which moments those are. Callum is 51 years old now. He lives in Terrace, which is where Bernard was from, which I have always found satisfying in a way I can't entirely defend logically. And he works as a forestry consultant, which also seems right to me in ways I don't need to explain. He is 6 feet and 4 inches tall and still growing, in the way that people sometimes continue to grow in small increments into their 40s and beyond. And his hands are large, and he moves with the particular deliberateness that I first noticed when he was 2 years old and have never stopped noticing. He has a daughter, Petra, who is his father's granddaughter in the most literal sense and who has, I am told, already begun to be noticed for her size and her stillness and the quality of her attention. Callum has told her some of it. I do not know how much. That is why I am making this recording, so that when she is ready for all of it, there is a version that is complete. He has been back to the Dease Lake country several times. He does not speak to me in detail about those visits, and I do not ask him for detail because I understand that some knowledge is personal in a way that does not admit of report, and that what he has learned in that country belongs to him and to whatever is in those hills, and not to any record I am authorized to keep. I know he goes. I know he comes back. I know that when he comes back, there is something settled in him that was not settled before, and that the settling is not the settling of a question answered, but the settling of a person who has stood in the full weight of who they are, without flinching and without requiring any official acknowledgement of it. Walter Fisk told me, in the last year of his life, that he had never once regretted what we all did in that summer of 1959, and in the years that followed. He said that the registry office in Victoria had a birth record that was technically accurate in all respects except the one that mattered, and that he was able to live with that discrepancy, because the discrepancy protected a child who had done nothing to deserve anything other than protection, and that he had long since decided that the protection of a child was a more serious moral obligation than the accuracy of a provincial document. He was 87 years old when he said this. He had been a church elder for 40 years, and he had opinions about moral obligation that he took seriously. And I believed him when he said he had no regrets, because Walter was also not a man who invented things. I have no regrets either. I have held this for 52 years, and I am ready to put it down, not because I am ashamed of having held it, but because I have held it long enough, and because the people who needed to be protected by its being held have grown up and made their own lives, and are capable now of holding it themselves. Petra will be capable of it. I am certain of this. Children who come from where she comes from do not lack for capacity. I want to say one more thing before I stop the recorder. It is not a thing I can prove, and it is not a thing I would put in a medical record, and it is not a thing that would survive a skeptical examination, and I am recording it here anyway, because this recording is not a medical record, and it is not meant to survive skeptical examination. It is meant to be the truth. On the evening of the 1st of May, 1999, 3 weeks after Nora died, I was sitting on the back step of my house in Smithers, in the dark, and I heard something. I heard it once, from the direction of the Bulkley Range, which is not close. It was miles away, and it came only once, and it was not a sound I can describe in terms of any instrument or any animal I know. It was low and tonal, and it held for a long time before it stopped. And when it stopped, the silence afterward was of a different quality than the silence before it. I sat very still for a long time. Then I went inside and I made tea and I sat at the kitchen table, which is where I am sitting now. And I thought about everything I have just told this recorder. Every piece of it, the ravine and the prints and the kitchen window, and Callum's hands and Nora's face in the last hours and the long years of summer visits and the sound in the hills, and I thought, this is what the world actually is. Not what we were told it was, what it actually is. And what it actually is more full and more careful and more patient and more gentle than anything I was trained to measure or any certificate I was given authorized me to expect. I have thought about that night for 12 years. I think about it still. I am not sorry it happened, and I am not sorry I am leaving this record of it. Callum knows where to find this recording. I trust him to give it to Petra when the time is right, and I trust Petra, when she has it, to understand that the people in this story did what they did because they loved each other across every distance and every difference that should have made love impossible, and that the love held, and that it is still holding, out there in the hills beyond the tree line, where no registry office has jurisdiction and no document goes. That is all I know. That is all anyone knows who was there.